Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Logocentric. My name is Daxton Page, and today we're going to be talking about why I left the left. Everybody's been retreating to the polls for the past 10 years, and I think a lot of this has started since Clinton and maybe even Bush. I'm not entirely sure. The analysis can get a little fuzzy depending on what we want to attribute the cause to, but essentially for the past 10, maybe even 15, 20 years, we've been in a very divisive state of politics. And one of the things that happened within that is that individuals have now been caught up in a very extreme form of rhetoric, in a very extreme form of identification with these movements that may not even have their individual best interests at heart. And so I want to talk about why I personally left the left and how I sort of feel a little bit politically homeless at the moment. And maybe you guys can help me identify where I lie. Who knows? So the first thing is first, what were the reasons that I left the left for? The first reason was to put it at, all on the table. I didn't like who I had become as an individual. I remember at one point I was so passionate about, hating Donald Trump and that he was literally the antithesis of everything American and that his presidency would be the downfall of the republic. I mean, that was my mindset during the 2016 election. I was about 21 at the time, and I was in college. And so I remember having an argument with my family. And I remember at one point, we were both just yelling at each other. And when I went back to my room and just kind of sat there for a minute, I'm like, what the hell is going on? Like, this is ugly. This is bad. I'm yelling at my family, and my family's yelling back at me because we're so polarized. And honestly, I instigated it, so it was my fault. And so I was like, man, what is going on? Why are we devolving into fights like this? Well, it turns out the problem was me and my very extreme and divisive way of looking at the world. I tried to basically deduce what I needed to do in politics to who are the good guys, and so I'll just follow the good guys. And I think that's a heuristic that a lot of people implement in their own lives, and I don't think it's a particularly great one. And so one of the things that just absolutely pushed me away from the left was a moment where I was like, if the way I'm thinking politically and my party has put me in a position where this is my normal state of, this is how I'm acting out in the world, I don't like this. And so I had to make sure, though, that this wasn't just an individual problem and was actually something that I could, root in the party. Now, it turns out both were true. There was definitely some problems in my individual character that I needed to address. And so diving into buying books, what you see behind me is actually a very recent phenomenon in my life. Growing up, I did not do very well at reading, not because I couldn't read, but I'm very high in a personality trait according to the Big Five personality model. I'm high in the trait openness, and I have a very hard time paying attention. Right? And so it's not that I couldn't read, it's just that to sit down and read a book about a story I had no interest in was absolutely like pulling teeth for me. And that continued all the way through high school. It was just impossible to get me to just sit down and read whatever these projects were putting me towards. But there were a few exceptions. One of the exceptions was Animal Farm. That one I actually felt pretty compelled while reading actually in class. Ayn Rand's Anthem was pretty good. It wasn't, I did sleep a lot in school during the reading portions. Anyway, I say all this to say, I had always slacked off, and particularly in the reading department, and at this particular point in my life, I had decided I'm going to invest in myself and see if, maybe I'm on the right side, but I just got all my priorities and my shit's out of order, right? So I decided to get my own house in order, clean my own room, as Jordan Peterson would say. But inevitably what happened is the more I learned about business, the more I understood why things that we see on the surface, not being involved in business, look like corruption, is actually just... Sorry about that, I got a phone call right in the middle of the video. So inevitably what happens is in college, I had one perception of how business operated, mostly that it was via corruption and it was just a bunch of greed. I was reading up on stories like Enron. But then I started to actually learn about real estate and stocks and how that actually worked. A great book I would recommend is called Money, Master the Game by Tony Robbins. And I just started to kind of see money for what it was and business for what it was. And it sort of lifted the veil of, the greedy capitalists taking over the world and all this kind of stuff, right? So I had these preconceptions kind of blown apart by reading more into psychology, economics, philosophy. These were like big interests of mine and still are, hence this podcast. And so that was one of the main decisions in pushing me away from the left. Now, another thing I would say that pushed me away from the left is once I started to do this, I made this fundamental shift in my personality to sort of just see what I was capable of. And I tried to promote this sort of way of living to my friends, right? I started broadcasting memes that sort of advertised this way of living to my friends and close family, and they really didn't get it. A lot of the left-leaning ones kind of were like, what is this? You're supporting this capitalist system that's oppressive and patriarchal, and why are you doing this? And I was noticing, okay, well, it seems like a bit of crab in the bucket syndrome going on. And that I noticed that was that was not the exception, that was the rule. Most people I knew that were hardcore on the left had a very high, like, crab in the bucket syndrome type mentality. Like, that's just the way they viewed people. It's like, no, if I can't be successful, I'm going to tear them down, and I'm going to deconstruct everything you say to kind of bring you down to my level to show you that all your blah 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 is just nothing and that you and I are exactly the same. It's like this very resentful way of looking at people. That's really how I discovered a lot of my close friends were looking at the world, and I didn't like it one bit. A lot of people that I respected, they started to say things that were very, very polarizing and divisive. They would say things like, the next election is not between left or right, but between good and evil. And you're an educator. There are young minds that are almost of the voting age that you're kind of speaking this to. This is a terrible message. What are you doing? This encourages an us versus them mentality and is actually contributing to the polarization, is not helping. The people on the left that I noticed, and when they were arguing, they were constantly basically trying to say, you're going to come to our side because I'm going to show you how terrible of a person you are for believing otherwise. And that's just not going to work. You're going to make people dig their heels, right? And so I started to try to dig into their claims to see if they had any substance on things like, abortion. Now that one we can go into in future episodes, and I actually want to, because that's a very complicated one. But a lot of the arguments I was told were terrible. So I debunked a lot of those arguments that I was told, and then the perceptions on economics. I talked about business, right? The perceptions about how a society should actually operate, and then everything would just eventually devolve into socialism. And once I read about the roots of socialism, the actual outcomes of putting socialism into practice, that pretty much, converted me completely to what I would prefer as a basic economic system to basic governance off of. Capitalism, socialism, I'm going with capitalism, right? And so a lot of these things just pushed me away from the left, and I found myself in a point where I couldn't justify saying that, I'm a Democrat anymore. I just couldn't do it. Now the thing is, I couldn't necessarily say that I was a Republican or conservative either. And I was sort of a contrarian in a sense. That's what sort of pushed me so far to the left initially, is I was like, if this is what the normal thing is, I definitely don't want to be that. So I'm just going to go to the opposite of this. Well, it turns out that was not a good way of looking at it, and it actually got too far. So, but I still couldn't justify saying, well, okay, I'm just a Republican now. So I feel a bit politically homeless. So I just want to go over briefly a few things that I would consider my political ethos, and you can drop in the comments what you would consider your political ethos and what you would consider yourself. I am a big proponent in individualism. I think the individual is the best way to conceptualize people. as individuals with their own unique set of characteristics, with their own unique sets of experiences and sufferings and advantages, and to take all of that into account as or on an individual basis, right? Not really, I don't like this collectivist view of just taking one group attribute, one, group characteristic, and then making that, some sort of, political representation. I don't like any of that. And so I'm a big proponent of responsibility over expedience. A lot of this comes from my research into people like Jordan Peterson, right? I believe that voluntarily adopting responsibility is the best way to achieve meaning in your life, right? I think just seeking short-term pleasure ends up with, short-term pleasure but long-term misery. And I think a lot of people are unfortunately willing to make that trade. And I think the opposite is probably the best way to go, right? I would rather have long-term, pleasure and short-term suffering, right? That sounds like a better plan to me. Another one of the things I wanted to put forth is that I am a pragmatist as opposed to like a postmodernist. Now, people would say, oh, you're kind of splitting hairs because aren't they, sort of the same thing? And not necessarily. It all depends on your conception about what reality is. And in my opinion, there is a reality that exists outside human cognition, and that there is meaning and truth that exists outside human cognition. However, I do believe that human cognition is limited in a sense that we don't have access to the purest 100% objective truth at all times, right? Sometimes we need to have sort of pragmatic truths that push us forward in the right direction, even though they may be fundamentally flawed in some way. Think of like Isaac Newton's idea of gravity, right? When Newton put forth gravity, that was a different conception of gravity than Einstein, right? But we would have never got to Einstein's analysis of gravity if we didn't first have Newton's, okay? And so it's like we're pushing forward into the right direction, even though our truths may be partially true, but partially untrue in some ways, right? That's my view about truth and pragmatism, right? And that's why I think I'm a pragmatist fundamentally, is I believe, yeah, there are some truths that are very complex, and sometimes in the absence of infinite knowledge about everything, we have to deal with this sort of compromised truth, right? Something that we can okay, we can just deal with this to get to just go forward, right? And so that's kind of my view, as opposed to postmodernism that suggests all that meaning is socially constructed and the only thing that remains is just power, and the only thing that's justified is power. So yeah, I fundamentally don't believe in that whole doctrine, and so I view myself as a pragmatist as opposed to postmodernist. Not to say that those things are absolutely opposite of one another, but that's kind of my view about it. I would say if I really pushed myself, I'm religious as opposed to secular, even though most of the time I would you say I talk in a secular way. I don't think of myself as like a theologian or a fundamentalist in any way. I'm sort of in the Jordan Peterson camp when it comes to religion. Or you could even say the Carl Jung camp when it comes to religion. I have a lot of books by him, and he's been a real big influence on my conception of what religion is and things of that nature. And so I find myself leaning a little bit more towards the religious side than the secular side. However, most of the time I use secular language. I try not to, evoke scripture for my logic and my reasoning, right? I like to use secular tools to understand religious phenomena, and so that's sort of my perspective on it. I'm also, like I mentioned earlier, I'm a capitalist as opposed to a socialist. I just think the evidence shows that free markets are the best way to run a society. I think, though, the biggest issue you run into is when the government starts giving privileges to certain classes of people or to certain businesses. Right, that's how you get like this kind of collective thing we're seeing now, or you get big businesses that sort of monopolize industries, right? Both of those phenomena result from bad government. So I'm very much opposed to the government having more control over things than they absolutely should. That's just absolutely necessary. So I'm an empiricist as opposed to, let's say, like a deconstructionist. So for that, I would say I believe in the scientific method as the best way to achieve those truths that we are trying to seek and to limit our biases to the best of our abilities, right? And to see where we are wrong and pursue what is actually true. And I feel like deconstructionism is a way to justify what you feel is true by trying to dismantle whatever anyone just said by using language games and rhetorical tricks. I'm a big psychoanalytic thinker, so I wouldn't say that I know everything about psychoanalysis, but I believe fundamentally in the proponents that there are forces at work in our subconscious that we are not totally aware of, and that we have to sort of work to integrate into our personality to become a more well-rounded human being, right? Because we're often possessed by emotions and things that come from our primordial side, our limbic system, I believe. And so what we need to do is pursue the integration of those things so that we are essentially in control of all of those primal emotions, right? But we're not completely, we're still alive and we're still spontaneous, creative creatures, right? I believe in free will, but I also believe in determinism. I guess the main thing I would say is I don't believe in hard determinism. I believe that free will and determinism can sort of coexist together. And my way of thinking about this, I'm interested to see what you guys would think about this, is the big thing that's put forth with hard determinism is that X causes Y. And that law of causality is what is that's the bedrock of determinism. And what I would say is free will is what causes X. So you can call that W. W causes X, which causes Y, right? And so that's sort of my framework about free will, right? I believe we have free will to make our own choices, but once we make those choices, to a degree, there might be a predetermined outcome to those choices. All right, so, and then the last two things I guess I would say about my political worldview or my moral worldview would be I'm in favor of due process as opposed to the trial of public opinion. I think no matter how clear, cut, and dry a case seems, the best thing to do is to take it to court, examine the evidence, look at it empirically, and go through that process and verify that that person is in fact guilty. I think if you really believe that something's cut and dry, then you should have no problem submitting it to this process because it would just expose what you already know to be true. The last thing I would say in regards to education would be I think teachers' primary role is to teach people how to think and not what to think. I've known people who are my age who are becoming teachers who are talking to their students, and they've admitted this, in a way that sort of glorifies the anti-colonial, postmodern, social justice viewpoint of the world. And, all you need to know is that the colonists were bad. It's like, no. You need to give them the cognitive toolkits that they need to understand that entire situation, and then you need to let them come to the conclusion as to whether they think the colonization of America was bad or good. You don't need to put that memory into their minds, because that's essentially what happens. That's essentially what happens as a teacher who you look up to as an influential figure who knows what they're talking about. They say something, you don't know any better, so you're just like, oh, that's probably true. That's the bias I did, that's the bias I acted out when I was in high school, and I listened to some of my history teachers and went, oh yeah, obviously that happened. Yeah, because he said it happened. But then I go and research it for myself, and it's like, that didn't happen. That was a lie. And I should have researched that for myself. So this is what I'm talking about. We need teachers that teach you how to think about certain things, especially history, how to think about it, not what to think about it, right? So you need the cognitive toolkits necessary to examine history from a very rational perspective and come to your own conclusion. And then you can have conversations with your peers who disagree with you, right? So this is my fundamental view of education, right? And we should foster the ability to think critically, not critical theory as it relates to critical race theory or all that kind of stuff. I mean actual critical thinking, trying to hold two opposing ideas in your head and battling them out together to see which, maybe this is true, and actually going through the facts and finding out what's true actually. All right, so that's all I've got for you today. Where do you think I fall on the political spectrum? Would you say that I've fundamentally drifted to the right, or would you still say I'm on the left? I'm a classical liberal. I basically heard the two definitions attributed to me, classical liberal or right-leaning libertarian. One of those is on the left, one of those on the right. I really don't know, so maybe you can help me out, right? So drop what you are. Are you a far right conservative? Are you a far left socialist? Are you somewhere in the middle? Right? I bet the odds are that you are somewhere in the middle. So let me know in the comments section. Also, like and share this video if you enjoyed it. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell to get notified when content just like this drops. Also, join our community over at Locals, where we're having conversations just like this, but a little bit more controversial because we're not allowed to have certain conversations on YouTube. So head over there, join our community where we're having the tough conversations that our society needs, but we're actually approaching it from a civil perspective. I'm Logocentric. Thanks for watching.